I remember my wife and I had a good relationship. We got married when she was 38 and I was 34. She divorced from her husband after the unexpected loss of their teenage son. I had never been married, but I was there for her, providing her a listening ear, a shoulder to cry on, and advice when I had it. My younger brother passed away, so I was very familiar with loss and how all you can really do is keep carrying on in honor of the loved one. I know my wife found strength, hope, and courage by watching, listening, and talking to me. I saw her physically change from an overweight, withered flower to a fit and glowing woman. We were married for 10 years, together for 12. I know it sounds like a long time, but it seems incredibly short when I say it. I didn't think I'd ever put a final number of years on our marriage. I worked in construction, building houses, and after I received my inheritance from my father, I designed and built my own. When it was done, my boss was so impressed with my architecture skills that he promoted me to that position. It was an incredible pay increase. This all happened before I met and married my wife, electing to share my wealth and good fortune with her. I thought that if anyone deserved a happy ending, it was her. 3 years into our marriage, she started a health, wellness, and healing video blog that changed the lives of several people. They looked up to her as an example of what they could become after a very traumatic life event. My wife had all the trust and privacy a woman could ask for. I never worried about her going behind my back, and I never asked to check her phone or accounts. She was never on her phone around me, but I did notice that whenever I came into a room and saw her on her phone, she'd lock it and put it down right away. I figured she did this out of respect for me, so I didn't feel ignored. She knew that I hated how people nowadays have their phone in their face at all times. With the phone down, she'd warmly smile at me and either listen to me or start a conversation. One day, I was working in my office when I noticed I had 2 missed calls from the police department. Worried, I called them back, and an officer told me that my wife was under arrest. I asked what the heck happened, and all she could say was that my wife was being charged with criminal mischief and destruction of property. My mind was spinning. I asked if she had the right woman, and she said they were certain they caught her on the property of the person that called. I realized I needed to speak to my wife right away, but the only place they'd allow me to do that was in an interview room. Sitting face to face in a white room with cameras rolling, backed my wife into a corner. She had to tell me the truth, no matter how unbelievable it was. It looked like she was wearing a mask because I'd never seen her face so defeated and flat before. After a few minutes of awkward silence, she told me she got revenge on a woman that stole her ex-husband, Stan, from her. Right away, I asked why she felt like she needed to get revenge now, after so many years. She looked away and started rubbing her arms like she was cold. She said she didn't know and she wouldn't tell me anything else. She actually requested to go back to her cell. I couldn't believe it. Everything was moving in slow motion as my wife was escorted back to her cell, and I wandered into the lobby of the police station, wondering what to do next. Before I could leave, a woman came rushing into the station, furious. When she spotted my wife, she started screaming insults and curse words at her for what she did to her house. The police surround both of them and try to calm them down to prevent things from escalating. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. After the woman, Bethany, calmed down, she took a seat on a bench, waiting for something. I took a seat a few feet away until I felt it was safe to tell her I was my wife's husband. She scoffed and said I married a little girl. I asked her if she could tell me what was going on, because my wife refused to say. It turns out my wife was getting revenge now because she was still sleeping with her ex-husband, Stan. Since I was looking at her like she was crazy, Bethany explained that she was Stan's girlfriend for many years, comforting him over the loss of his son, even before my wife and Stan got divorced. Without Bethany knowing, my wife started sleeping with Stan again 2 years prior. Missing their son made her reach out to him, and the rest is history. I was trying to hide the fact that I was falling apart. I had no idea my wife was still talking to her ex, let alone sleeping with him. I had been played like a fiddle. To keep myself from crying, I asked Bethany what my wife did to her house. She said she spray painted on the front of it and broke 3 windows. This made her start crying hard, expressing how embarrassed she was and that she felt like the laughingstock of the neighborhood. I apologized to her, but she only sobbed that neither of us knew our spouse was cheating on us any chance they got. She gave me an awkward hug, but I think we both needed it. So after more than a decade together, I found out my wife is sleeping with her ex again. And I couldn't forget I was in a police station because of my wife's unexpected jealousy and rage. She had a bond set, but I didn't try to pay it. She was sentenced to a very large fine, and she had to pay Bethany for the damages she caused. Everyone in town heard about what happened, and she instantly got shunned by the community. OP, I am so sorry your wife went back to her ex after all those years. She certainly didn't need to, she just chose to. She had a new and wonderful marriage with you, but the loss of her son continued to weigh heavily until she used it as an excuse to contact her ex. Feelings and emotions are often misleading and confusing. Just because you miss one person, you may contact another for comfort and solace, which is something that spouses offer each other. If you aren't careful, temptation may arise, and you better be wise enough to turn away and have an honest conversation with the person you're in a relationship with. It might have been a mistake to reach out to another person in the first place, but at least you stopped yourself from making an even bigger mistake. Talking to your spouse about it afterwards is a critical step for accountability and remembering not to do the same thing again. Obviously, every situation is unique, but it's usually a good rule of thumb to leave exes in the past where they belong. Thank you for sharing with us. Now let's get into our next story for today. My wife, 40 female, and I, 45 male, were extremely excited to send the kids to summer camp for a month. We hadn't had alone time in over a year, and she was always a little worried about having sex at night because she didn't want them to hear anything. Once they were gone, we had one extremely romantic night where we had loud sex in random places. It was wonderful, but the next day we were content. Having any more loud, randomly placed sex seemed unnecessary, and my wife started to get depressed and talk about the kids coming home. I asked her where she'd want to go, if she could go anywhere, and she said Georgia. It was where she grew up and where her parents lived in a nursing home. I absolutely hated Georgia. I only lived there for a few years, but it was a terrible town where I feared getting caught in the crossfire of a drug deal that went south. I never got shot, but I was dragged into neighborhood drama and victim to several robberies. If I was to go anywhere, I'd want to go to Kentucky to stay at my uncle's. He was like a father figure to me, and for much of my adult life, our relationship was long distance. He was getting older, and I wanted one more visit where I got to help him work on his old cars. Our vacation discussion only made the atmosphere in the house worse. It felt like we were growing apart, but I didn't want to see it that way. I knew something had to be done, so I called my wife's closest friend, Penny, to ask what she thought we should do. She recommended we take a trip separately and volunteered to go with my wife to Georgia. I loved this idea, even though I was nervous to split from my wife. I'd slept next to her every night for more than 13 years, but I thought maybe that was why it was time for us to have our own adventure and miss each other a little. I proposed this idea to my wife, and she was all for it, since we'd be back before summer camp was over. She started planning, packing, and texting on her phone. I was actually a little bummed that she didn't show any hesitation to part from me, but I knew she was a strong woman, so I didn't let it get to me. However, a week into our separate vacations, she started replying less to my texts, and whenever she did reply, it was short. I was having a great time with my uncle, and I did manage to forget about my wife and phone for a while, but I eventually felt like I had to message Penny to ask if my wife was behaving strangely. She was hesitant to tell me that my wife went out without her a few nights, and most recently, she hadn't slept at the hotel. I freaked out. My heart had been telling me something was up, but I didn't listen. I asked if she had any idea where she'd be, and she didn't know. I remembered that my wife signed into her Facebook Messenger on my phone once when her phone was broken. I was able to sign back in and look through her messages. I found one string with an old flame of hers who lived in Georgia and talked about how nice it would be if she ever came back to Georgia for a visit. They exchanged Snapchat IDs, and that was the end of the messages there. I looked up AP's name online and paid $2 to see a list of his most recent addresses. According to this, he lived 45 minutes away from my in-laws' nursing home. I drove 6 hours to the address and arrived at 1 a.m., finding my wife's car in the driveway. I couldn't believe I actually found her. I banged on the door until AP answered it, with a gun in my face. I demanded my wife back. His look went from angry to surprised. She came out in a robe, full of disbelief. She asked how I found her and started shaking and crying. Before I answered her, she pleaded with AP to lower the gun and told me we should just go home because this was a huge mistake. I looked at AP and asked him if he had sex with my wife. He said yeah, called me a name, and asked what I was going to do about it. I told him he spoke like a coward behind a gun. In his anger, he raised it again, which made my wife start screaming and pleading. I backed up towards my car with my hands up, telling my wife she's not coming with me. She expressed her disbelief as I said she could stay with this jerk for all I cared. She wailed and asked me about the kids as I shut my door and yelled out the window that she should have thought about them before cheating on me. I drove all the way home in silence. I broke the news to the kids that Mommy wouldn't be living with us anymore because she married another man. They were confused and heartbroken, and whenever she video called them, it was extremely awkward and nothing like being there in person. She didn't try to visit for a year, and whenever she did, the damage to her relationship with the kids was painfully obvious. They didn't want to listen to her, they didn't want to hug her, and they argued about everything she told them. She went back to AP and continued living with him, even after she found him cheating on her. She just started ranting about it on Facebook, talking about how it was the last time and she was going to leave and never look back. That kept happening for 5 years, until AP died unexpectedly. Now I don't know where she's living, but I assume she's somewhere in Georgia, surviving in poverty without knowing her teenage children. OP, you didn't deserve to have the wife and mother of your children cheat on you. She just gave into the emotions and feelings that formed when she started communicating with this loser all over again. Marriage is full of challenges and times when you feel distant from your spouse. In times like this, the best thing you can do is remember that life is always changing. In 24 hours, you may not feel the same way you do at that moment. Give yourself and your spouse time, even if it is apart, to get out of the funk that everyone experiences. Our egos and our own self-entitlement can screw up even the best relationship, just because we think we deserve something. Never, ever cheat on your spouse. It's not worth it, and like a snake, it'll come back to bite you when you least expect it. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, comment below with your thoughts on what happened. If there is a story you would like to share with me about your own situation or someone else's, then please do not hesitate to contact me. Take care.